Okay, let's do some extra work here with absolute and relative change with percentages. Now, the big thing with this is thinking about percentages sometimes as percentage points. First, let's think about absolute change. So remember that absolute change is the absolute value of the final value minus the initial value. And the relative change is the final minus initial all over the initial. And generally the relative change, right, this answer here will be a decimal. And then oftentimes we will change that to a percent by multiplying by 100, and then we call it percent change. Okay, but that's kind of getting in a little further. So let's just think about this. I just achieved my goal of 27% BMI. The absolute change from 2 years ago shows a decrease of 5.3 percentage points. Now, if we think about this, when it says 5.3 percentage points, we could also write that as 5.3%, right? This is the idea, is that sometimes percents are just numbers, right? This 27% BMI, that's just 27% is just a number. So that's why we sometimes say percentage points, because then you think of it more as points and not just as percentages. So let's think about what this says. I've reached my goal. So the current value, right, the final value is 27. The absolute change is 5.3. So we know that absolute change is final minus initial in the absolute value bars. So if I plug this in, I can say 5.3 is the same as 27 minus the initial value. Well, and it's a decrease, right? So we know that initially it was more. Okay, this is where it might get a little bit confusing. Let me come here. So if it's a decrease of 5.3, the easiest way is to throw a negative out here. Because we know, let me just go to a different page. If we think about the absolute value of 3, that means it's positive, right? The idea of absolute value is the distance from 0 on a number line. So if this is 0, we have positive 3 and negative 3. They are both 3 units from 0. So when we think about absolute value, right, the fact that these are in absolute value bars means it could be positive or it could be negative. But if you have a change, if you take a pay cut, you don't say, they took negative 30,000 from my salary. You say, I have a pay cut of 30,000. They decreased my salary by 30,000. So that's why we talk about it in terms of it's a decrease of 5.3. So when we're thinking about our equation, if we know it's a decrease, we can throw this negative out here and then we can solve this. All right. So in solving this equation, I'm going to subtract 27 from both sides. That would go away, and I have negative initial, and negative 5.3 minus 27 gives me negative 32.3. And feel free to use a calculator, right? And then we're going to divide both sides by 1, because a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive initial value of 32.3%, because we're talking the initial, this is a BMI, right? A body mass index, which is talked about in terms of percentages. So you would say that 2 years ago, I had a BMI of 32.3%. Then we had a decrease of 5.3, and now I'm at my goal of 27. So after you find your answer, talk through it. Does that make sense? If the answer is yes, then you know you're right. And if it makes no sense, then you probably missed something along the way. All right, let's do another one. I just started a new business. To start, my first month's budget had 90% going to office supplies, and then the budget in month 6 only had 30% going to office supplies. What is the absolute change in the budget for office supplies? Sorry about the extra U there. Okay, so again, remember, absolute change is the absolute value of final minus initial. Go through this problem and think about, what do we know? First month's budget, well, that's initial. So I equals 90. And then it says in month 6, we had 30%. That's the final, month 1 to month 6. So we would say the absolute change is the absolute value of 30 minus 90. 30 minus 90 is negative 60. Absolute value of negative 60 is 60. So that means the absolute change is 60. It was a 60 percentage point decrease. Right, that's kind of how we can talk about it if we're using a sentence. So the big key is we would either say 60 percentage point decrease, or sometimes you would just say it was a 60%, right? That's the absolute change is 60%. It was a decrease, went down. So you kind of have to watch out that you might have to throw that percent because it's a number, right? It's like saying 60 dogs. Same idea. When you're dealing with the absolute and relative change with percentages, we are just think about this percent sign meaning dogs, cats, computers, hats, cans of Coke. I don't care what it is, right? Think of that as a label, and then you can keep it as a label.